What's the real job of an FBI profiler like? What's it like to be a detective or a federal prosecutor, or to make it your mission to catch the serial killer who killed your cousin? What's it like to be the father of a missing and murdered Indigenous woman? At the Silver Linings Handbook podcast, we explore conversations that inspire with people from all walks of life. I'm Jason Blair, the host. Come join us for these interesting conversations wherever you get your podcasts.
This week, I'm taking my time machine back to the year 1933 because it's going to take a bit longer to explore the life of John Dillinger, a Depression-era bank robber who one biographer referred to as the Elvis of bandits. My investigation into Dillinger's life and many crimes has deepened quite a bit since part one, and I cannot wait to tell you more on this episode of Vintage Villains. Welcome back to Vintage Villains, everybody. I'm Allison Dickson, and for the last several weeks, I have been steeped in the lore of American gangsters, gun malls, and G-men. Originally, I'd intended to do a single episode on Dillinger, but I was 15 pages deep into my outline, having barely scratched the surface when I realized what utter folly that would be. And I've since discovered that trying to do Dillinger's story proper justice in 2 parts was equally foolish. Suffice it to say, as of this recording, I'm feeling like this is going to be 3 or 4 parts, maybe with room for a bonus episode. And all the reading I've been doing, what I've been taking away from it is that John Dillinger's life and crimes cast a very wide net that dozens of people, each with their own complex stories, got caught up in. And that's before you even get to the wider implications of his crime spree that can still be felt today, believe it or not, especially when you consider the enormous law enforcement apparatus we now have and take for granted in this country. But there was no such apparatus back in 1933 when Dillinger started making a name for himself. His gang and others operating during that same period would certainly be the genesis for it, though. But also, researching this case has presented some unique challenges, and I suspect it might have something to do with this villain's level of notoriety, which is even more complicated by the fact that he's been dead for 90 years, 90, nearly a century. That might seem counterintuitive. After all, the more famous the person, the more information about them, right? It should, if anything, make the process of putting together a compelling story that much simpler. The problem is, when someone reaches mythic status in life, for good or ill, a lot of the information being passed around about them is, well, myth. Even in Dillinger's day, the press was in the habit of writing stories first and asking questions later. Add a near century of time between then and now, and you're going to have a huge pile of wheat and chaff to separate. And you only discover that to be the case when you start cross-referencing certain details. Now, most people doing a casual search on a topic don't go that far. They find a source from a reputable news organization like, say, PBS, and they assume, as anyone should, the info has already been vetted before publication. And most times that's true. But errors and half-truths still slip through to be passed around until they have the appearance of truth. Large omissions are also made in the interest of saving time and, space on the website or newspaper or whatever else you're doing. Don't worry, PBS, I'm only grumbling at you a little bit. While their American Experience write-up is way more detailed than what you'll find in a lot of places, they still left a lot on the cutting room floor about Dillinger's movements, and he was admittedly very busy. And they got some facts just plain wrong, such as when Dillinger met his fellow gang members Harry Pierpont and Homer Van Meter in prison. Thankfully, I was working with enough lead time, so I was able to go in and make some corrections on the episode that went out last week. And to any of my Patreon subscribers who listened to version 1.0, though, I apologize for subjecting you to my rough drafts. It was nothing major, by the way. PBS nailed the broader strokes just fine. But for what I'm trying to accomplish here, I need more accuracy. And so does everyone else, for that matter. For instance, there is a more significant detail treated as fact that isn't quite, and it's the $50 that Dillinger and Ed Singleton allegedly stole from local grocer Frank Morgan. I told you that story last week. Every online biography of Dillinger makes some mention of how he was sent to prison for a decade for stealing $50. Heck, I even used that info as part of the fictional Dillinger story I wrote that I mentioned in episode 1. Well, as you now know from episode 1, the robbery of Frank Morgan was botched, and no money was actually stolen. People just used that shorthand to communicate that Dillinger would have only netted around $50 or $60 had he and Ed Singleton succeeded. Now, that might not sound like an important distinction, but hear me out for a sec. First, what Dillinger did to Frank Morgan is awful. He could have killed the old man. Dillinger was on the bullet train to Bad Guy City, and if he hadn't been stopped here, he probably would have done something to actually warrant that decade-plus prison sentence. But do I believe the sentence is harsh in light of the crime that was adjudicated? Yeah, I do. I also believe that had Dillinger received a sentence similar to Ed Singleton's, he might have emerged from that more lightweight Pendleton facility a less dangerous man than the much older maniac in training that strolled out of Michigan City, ready to rob the world blind for all his troubles. Having the facts correct on this case makes it a little easier to see Dillinger's mindset and how the prison system may have contributed to it. Even federal agent Melvin Purvis, who ultimately brought Dillinger down, and you'll be hearing a lot more about him in coming episodes, he stated in his memoir, "There is probably no one whose career so graphically illustrates the inadequacies of our system as does that of John Dillinger." That quote probably also explains why I'm so drawn to covering this case and so many other similar cases on this show. I want to see that, system at work and how it led to what we're sitting in today. We have questions all the time of why are we like this? Why are we dealing with these issues right now? And studying cases from history is often the best way to understand that a little better. Now, let's move away from mistakes in coverage and talk more about filling in some of the knowledge gaps I had when I put part 1 together. I knew my research would be continuing as the parts aired, so it would be easy enough to bring new discoveries to you as I went. All the major media articles focus on Dillinger's very first bank robberies that began in late June, about 6 weeks or so after he got out of prison. But there's not much listed about what all he got up to before he started hitting banks more regularly. This led me, and likely others, to believe he was just laying low and making careful plans about which banks to rob. But I was wrong. Dillinger was doing anything but playing it safe. Within days of his parole, he began sticking up grocery stores with other local ne'er-do-wells, even pistol whipping an elderly manager in the mouth and shattering his dentures. But those were his illicit after-dark activities. That was also the thing about John Dillinger. He was extremely dichotomous. There was a good boy daytime Johnny and a bad boy nighttime Johnny. By day, good boy Johnny was trying to get in good with his father and stepmom Lizzie's Quaker church. And by the way, something I discovered between last week and this week is that Lizzie died of a long illness the very same day Dillinger was released from prison, having taken her last breath while he was making the trek from Michigan City down to Mooresville. There's something almost ominous about that, isn't there? Anyway, something about John Jr. wasn't sitting right with the Quaker congregation. Maybe they didn't believe he'd been properly reformed in prison, and rightly so, because he was very much not reformed. Or maybe some folks were hearing gossip about some of Nighttime Johnny's exploits. It was a small town after all. Either way, the churchgoers weren't buying the penitent man act for a second and pretty much told him so to his face, which ultimately soured Dillinger's attempts to find religion, however hollow they may have been. Adding to his troubles, Dillinger's parole officer would soon be putting out for his arrest again because the guy just couldn't manage to stay in town or show up for all his required check-ins. Nighttime Johnny's activities with his new gang were finally eating into daytime Johnny's time to do good boy stuff. Alas, no matter how you may try to divide the hours, you can never get more than 24 of them in a day. And I'm sure no one was more resentful of that fact than John Dillinger. Those ne'er-do-wells I mentioned earlier that Johnny was running with and sticking up grocery stores and the like, well, they were a small Indianapolis gang known as the Whitecaps. Many of the standard write-ups skip this part of the story almost entirely, even the ones published on the FBI's website. Maybe it's because these small-time capers happened before the agency's involvement, so they leave those out. And most articles about Dillinger tend to focus on the latter half of his brief career, at the peak of his fame, after he broke out of the Allen County Jail in Lima. But the Whitecaps were originally just a few young hoodlums looking to take quick, low-risk scores. A lot of the banks on Dillinger's list to hit when he got out of prison, he and his buddies, and they're the ones he would eventually bust out of prison, they had spent years putting together like this dream list of all the banks that they were going to hit. And well, this was during the height of the Roaring 20s when they were, going off to prison. And by 1933, though, most of those banks were boarded up, thanks to the Great Depression. So the gang stuck to retail for the time being. And I'm being generous here when I say they were mostly a bunch of bumbling buffoons out there, engaging in the sort of goofy hijinks that made old Bugs Bunny cartoons funny. On Dillinger's first post-prison outing as a robber, the one where he smashed the old man's dentures, the gang's attempts to steal a car and switch the license plates resulted in 2 separate police chases before that robbery even began. And the next job, a Kroger store, Dillinger's fellow gang member, William the Kid Shaw, a nickname of failed aspirations if there ever was one, neglected to mention that he'd already hit the place a week prior. So when they all strode in, guns in hand, and demanded the money from the till, the cashier recognized Shaw immediately and rolled his eyes. "Oh, you again," he said, before informing them that since the last visit, they stopped keeping large sums of cash in the store. They got away with a few measly bucks anyway. Like I said, it took a bit for Johnny to get his sea legs. But Dillinger was always thinking of the long game when it came to getting his core gang together. He took his meager gains from the Whitecap jobs and began bribing certain prison officials in the hopes of getting Harry Pierpont released at his upcoming parole hearing that August. I think I might have mentioned that in episode 1, but he also invested a lot in guns and fast cars, the 2 things he loved more than money and pretty brunettes. The Whitecaps were a volatile and amorphous group, with folks coming and going. A lot of them ended up arrested, though Dillinger was coated in luck and Teflon during this time, managing to hightail it out of a tight spot, even if it meant his buddies were arrested instead. Loyalty really wasn't so much of a thing in this gang. Dillinger seemed to be running with them more to occupy his time and make some money to help get his real friends out of prison. And that lack of loyalty would come back to bite him, as folks like William the Kid Shaw were happy to squeal to police every detail they knew about Dillinger in exchange for a lighter punishment. But that didn't really slow him down. Johnny was a man of many prospects and places to rob and hearts to steal. I'll be getting more to that in just a second. Anyway, I found all of this information and more in a fantastic biography, John Dillinger, The Life and Death of America's First Celebrity Criminal by Derry Matera. I tried a few different Dillinger books as sources, but I found this one to be particularly compelling because the author had access to an 1,800-page cache of painstaking research compiled over the course of 50 years by a former Pinkerton detective from Indiana and a Chicago historian for a biography that never materialized before one of the men died. Matera wrote this book based on that research, and it creates a picture of Dillinger's life that jumps off every page, crammed with so much detail, but in a very readable way. I obviously cannot include all of it in a few hours of podcast, so I highly recommend picking up this book if these episodes find you wanting for more. I'll have a link to it in the show notes. Anyway, I think it's important to remember going through the whole rest of this brutal saga that despite all of Dillinger's many faults and transgressions, he had a family who loved him, and by all accounts, he loved them too. He was also introspective enough to know he didn't exactly deserve such a supportive clan. When he was holed up in the jail in Lima, he wrote his father a letter. Here's what it says. "Maybe I'll learn someday, Dad, that you can't win in this game. I know I've been a big disappointment to you, but I guess I did too much time. For where I went in a carefree boy, I came out bitter toward everything in general. Of course, Dad, most of the blame lies with me, for my environment was of the best. But if I had gotten off more leniently when I made my first mistake, this never would have happened. I preferred to stand trial here in Lima because there isn't so much prejudice against me here, and I'm sure I'll get a square deal here. Dad, don't believe all the newspapers say about me, for I am not guilty of half the things I'm charged with, and I've never hurt anyone. Just wanted you to know I am well and treated fine. From Johnny." Of course, as Dillinger wrote this letter, he was holding to his true dichotomous ways, knowing full well that the brigade of men he'd helped escape the prison in Michigan City were coming to bust him out, and that he would be back in the thick of things in no time. It should be noted that the 10 escapees would be quickly whittled down to 8 when one was caught and another killed. The one killed, by the way, was none other than Mr. James Jenkins, brother of Dillinger's former beloved, Mary Jenkins Longnecker of Dayton, Ohio. Old Jim was separated from the group early on and held someone at gunpoint to get a ride to the place where he thought a getaway car would be stashed for him. Only that turned out to be a dead end. He ended up in a nearby town where locals recognized him as one of the escaped convicts. The state police were out in huge force. This was huge news, this prison break. And Jenkins ended up being on the losing end of a brief shootout after he pulled his gun and shot a local farmer in the shoulder. That farmer took Jenkins out with a shotgun. Due to Jenkins' new fame being associated with the prison break and with Dillinger's growing celebrity, thousands attended Jenkins' funeral just to get a look at one of the gang. The man who fired that fatal shot had to watch his back for the rest of his life, for fear that any number of wannabe gangsters would ice him to get on Johnny's good side. It just goes to show how deadly one man's influence can be. So by the time Dillinger and his gang fled Lima and reached their hideout in Hamilton, Ohio, another spot I have a strong family connection to, their names and faces were plastered on scores of front pages. Harry Pierpont's senseless murder of Sheriff Sarber not only infuriated other law enforcement, it also soured Dillinger's mood. He reportedly liked the affable sheriff. Although he was impulsive in his own way, he didn't have the same rage and bloodlust that Pierpont had. The larger public was becoming more frightened as well, fed by a media painting an effective picture of hardened escaped convicts willing to murder cops to rescue their great leader and mastermind. Following the escape from Lima, this would be the peak Dillinger era before things started their inevitable skid toward disaster in early 1934. It's hard to believe his reign of terror only lasted about a year. It often seems the most highly destructive forces, from hurricanes to atomic bombs, are short-lived. It's the only grace we're offered in such matters. The early 1930s is a fascinating era in the study of crime for reasons I've already laid down, given the economic and cultural landscape of Prohibition and the Great Depression. But the world was changing very quickly, and there was a considerable lag in technology between cops and robbers. And the robbers, well, they were way ahead of the game, at least for a little bit. It comes down to a few things: guns, cars, and communication. I'll start with guns, but I'm only going to talk about one in particular: the Thompson submachine gun, aka the Tommy gun. Yes, that classic rapid-fire boomstick you can quickly imagine in the hand of any caricature of an old-timey gangster, complete with the fedora, pinstripe suit, and maybe a cigarette jutting from the corner of a seamed mouth. The ability for most of us to conjure up that image so easily is one reason why the Tommy gun was discontinued in 1944. Its associations with organized crime definitely created a stigma for the military, who used them extensively as trench brooms on the battlefields of World War I. But there were other big drawbacks. The Thompson weighed 14 pounds, which made carrying it a nightmare, and I think that's even before you add in all the ammo you need to carry. And most soldiers would be spending more time lugging it around than firing it. It was also expensive to manufacture. But in the hands of anyone strong enough to wield it, the Tommy gun was a beast. Its heft made it easy to control while firing, no recoil at all. Particularly nice if you had one perched in the back window of a speeding hot rod. And it was capable of firing 800 rounds a minute from either 50 or 100 round drums, so accuracy wasn't much of a concern either. The thing was designed to spray 45 caliber bullets wherever you pointed it. What's more, if you were a normal civilian, you could walk into any sporting goods store and purchase one without any kind of permit, for the mere fact that the government classified it as a rifle, which has fewer legal restrictions than easily concealed pistols. Doesn't sound much different nearly a century later, now does it? Local law enforcement at the time wasn't rolling in artillery like you're accustomed to seeing today, especially in the more rural areas bank robbers preferred to target. Taxpayers responsible for funding such things probably felt like it was overkill, and history gives us countless examples of governments being very slow to react to rapid change. There's a system of checks and balances to run through. It's always going to lag a little. Some police precincts, though, would have maybe one or two Thompsons in their arsenals if they were lucky. Meanwhile, guys like Capone, Dillinger, Babyface Nelson, and the aptly named Machine Gun Kelly were armed to the gills. More in a bit on how both sides built their stockpiles, though, in this crazy version of an arms race. Now let's talk about vehicles. Typically, police cars in those days were underpowered four-cylinder Model A Fords or equivalent Chevys that couldn't compare to the raw power of the V8 monsters preferred by the likes of Dillinger and these other gangsters. In particular, Dillinger loved the Essex Terraplane 8, built by the Hudson Motor Company, which could get up to an unprecedented, legendary 90 miles per hour. Though it should be noted, the suspension and braking systems of these cars were still archaic enough to make such speeds extremely reckless, though that didn't exactly stop these guys from trying. Ironically, though, thanks to the work of guys like Dillinger, building up muscular motor fleets became much easier for the cops, simply because the gangs saw most of their vehicles as single use, often abandoning them on roadsides for different ones as soon as they were clear of the law. So the toys that gangsters were leaving behind in their wake were in effect helping bring them more swiftly to their ultimate demise. But communication was an even bigger problem for the police, and why, if a getaway car was sporting enough muscle under the hood while a gangster fired a Tommy gun or threw handfuls of roofing nails out of the back window, they were usually home free. Two-way radios, which would allow cops to talk back and forth in real time from their vehicles so they could set roadblocks and get a head jump on fleeing bandits in neighboring towns, those wouldn't become a thing for around another decade. That said, some states were dropping some serious cash into interagency radio systems that would at least allow the stations to quickly communicate so they can more quickly relay info to the police out in the field. The only problem, again, was that the distrust of law enforcement ran high among American citizens in those days. I spoke a little bit about this in my recent series on the Oklahoma Girl Scout murders, where another outlaw, Pretty Boy Floyd, was able to walk openly through his hometown in that same area of Oklahoma, thanks largely in part to the people's distrust of cops. It's only in the last 20 or 30 years where we've started to see police departments deploying military-level artillery. But back then, many states were reluctant to put such firepower into the hands of state police. In particular, Indiana State Police Captain Matt Leach, a very cunning World War I veteran who'd made the capture of Dillinger into an obsession that was driving him to act very erratically. So the cops were at a disadvantage in 1933, especially in the rural, flat areas of the Midwest. And a lot of bad guys were ready to exploit that. Which perhaps answers my question from episode 1, what is it about Indiana and bank robbers? Well, the answer seems pretty self-evident when I think about all the times I've driven across my neighboring state and seen those wide open vistas that you could just speed a car down just to get away from, pursuing much slower cops. And heck, the same can be said for Ohio. I recently drove a lot of those roads Dillinger likely traveled here in the northwest quadrant of the state. And I have to say, not much has changed since 1933. Most of those roads are still only identified by letter and are just wide enough to accommodate a couple of passing Model A Fords. But Dillinger apparently wasn't limiting himself to the Hoosier or Buckeye states. Though not listed on his official bank tally, mostly due to a lack of hard evidence, Dillinger is suspected to have spent that summer of 1933 at banks in Kentucky, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. And given how much he loved fast cars and how much he apparently loved to drive, I wouldn't count that out, actually. That said, a lot of gangs and other copycats were in operation outside Dillinger's main circle, and they employed very similar tactics. George Babyface Nelson, who was something of a competitor for the same shocking headlines, committed at least one robbery that was initially pinned on Dillinger that summer, but it was pinned on him for a good reason. Nelson's getaway vehicle was registered under one of Dillinger's known aliases. Apparently, the Jackrabbit, a nickname Dillinger earned due to his acrobatic tendency to leap over the gates that separated bank lobbies from the cashier, well, he was known to loan out some of his souped-up fleet to fellow hooligans, even though they ran in separate gangs. Now you might be wondering, now that Dillinger is a free man yet again, isn't he at all concerned with reuniting with his beloved Mary Longnecker back in Dayton? Well, apparently she'd already begun ingratiating herself with another tenant in the boarding house while she was waiting for Dillinger to return for her. That man was named Claude Constable, and upon Dillinger's arrest in September, police would be suspicious that Claude was part of Dillinger's outfit. In order to get him off the hook, Mary would confess her affair. And you might think that Dillinger, upon learning about his lady love's betrayal, would be heartbroken over this, but that wouldn't be so. Dillinger was a man, like I said, of many prospects, and earlier that summer, he'd made the acquaintance of another beautiful brunette from Kokomo, Illinois. Her name was Mary. Yes, another Mary. There are so many Marys in this story. Mary Evelyn Frechette, but history knows her best by the nickname Billie. And these two crazy kids, well, they would basically become soulmates. The story of Billie Frechette's early life perhaps offers a glimpse as to why these two fell so madly in love with one another. Her early life saw a great deal of upheaval. Born on the Menominee Native Reservation in Neopit, Wisconsin, to a French and Native American mother and a French father, Billie had several brothers and sisters, and she attended the Catholic school on the reservation. But by age 13 or so, she would apparently be orphaned and sent to a government school up in South Dakota. She and her sister, due to their strong Anglo features, could assimilate easily enough into places outside the reservation, so she and her sister would put on Native American skits at local churches. But by 17, Billie had a reputation for liking to party a lot, and she ended up pregnant while unmarried. As was custom for many at the time in such situations, she gave birth to a son in a home for unwed mothers and named him William. She then left the baby in their care, ostensibly to be adopted out. Horrifically, William would only live to be about 3 months of age. He and around 20 other infants would actually die at a larger orphanage in Beulah, Michigan, where many of these babies were shipped off, which became known as the Death Farm. While many of these infants were suspected to have been poisoned or even beaten to death before being buried in the property's nearby sand dunes, baby William apparently died from complications of syphilis, which he contracted from his mother. She would not learn of this, however, for several years. After giving birth, Billie moved to Chicago, and it's through a series of mutual acquaintances that she would meet John Dillinger, who fell head over heels for her pretty much on sight. Prior to staging the breakout at the Allen County Jail, Harry Pierpont arranged to have Billie picked up and brought to the Hamilton, Ohio hideout, thereby completing the thanks Harry owed Dillinger for arranging his prison escape. Once everyone was reunited and happy, Dillinger and Pierpont immediately began to plan their next robbery. But first, they needed to stock up on guns, ammo, and perhaps some bulletproof vests, which had only recently become a staple in some police departments. Dillinger was definitely intrigued by those. But where to get such supplies? Probably a lot of you are thinking a sporting goods store. Alas, no. On October 14th, the gang traveled up to Auburn, Indiana to rob themselves a police station. Sounds beyond crazy, doesn't it? Robbers robbing the cops? It was an idea so unheard of that the two deputies at the Auburn police station could only gawp in surprised dismay when the three well-dressed men, Dillinger, Pierpont, and Charlie Mackley, casually strolled in through the PD doors and told them this is a holdup. They herded the officers into a holding cell and then proceeded to relieve the Auburn PD of a dozen different pistols, rifles, including the coveted Thompson SMG, as well as 3 bulletproof vests and a massive stock of ammunition. Such a ballsy and unprecedented move sent ripples of shock and fear through the community, and that was certainly the intention behind it. The gang quickly grew to near untouchable status in the eyes of the public, which was designed to thwart both police as well as any attempts for citizen vigilantes to get in on the action. And none were quite so infuriated over this as Indiana State Police Captain Matt Leach, the one who I mentioned a moment ago, was growing more frayed by the day. And he was particularly angry because he'd received a tip about the pending holdup and sent police there to be ready for it. Only he'd sent them to the town of Aurora, Indiana, 160 miles south, insisting that this was what the snitch had told him. Mixing up Aurora and Auburn is an easy enough mistake for a snitch to make, if indeed it was a mistake, but a costly and humiliating one for the beleaguered captain, who was being ridiculed by the press, as well as blaming officials in Ohio for refusing to turn Dillinger over when Indiana requested him. He reminded them that their sheriff would still be alive had they done so. Ohio, meanwhile, lobbed back a fact grenade of their own, reminding them of their failure to keep their convicts in prison, as well as not apprehending Dillinger long before he ever found his way to Dayton. You know, I might be a little biased here as an Ohio resident, but I'm gonna have to give the point to Ohio on this one. Amid all this, though, Leach hired a 6-member mobile Dillinger squad to work 24/7, tracking the movements of the gang and following up on various leads. He also tapped his enormous network of rats and other informants, hoping to squeeze any information out of them he could. One such informant was Harry Pierpont's own brother Fred, who gave up the location of the Hamilton hideout. However, by the time police could rustle the posse together, the gang had already cleared out of there, likely tipped off by crooked cops on Dillinger's payroll in the local gambling and brothel establishments. Matt Leach wasn't the only one with a strong network of rats and vermin on the enemy's side of the fence. In order to detract from the many failures of his law enforcement efforts, Captain Leach turned up the volume on the public relations machine, dubbing Dillinger Public Enemy Number 1 and his crew the Terror Gang. Leach also inflated the number of robberies attributed to Dillinger to more than 24, stating, "When all the known facts about Dillinger are dragged into publicity, it will be found that no desperado in America can approach this bad man's record." Like the souped-up hot rods the thieves left behind only for police departments to add them to their own lame fleets, this public proclamation only helped the desperados, bolstering their inflated egos to stratospheric heights. And the gang was not done growing their arsenal off the backs of John Q. Taxpayer. They robbed another police station, this one in Peru, Indiana, making off with 2 more fully loaded Tommy guns and a host of other rifles, shotguns, pistols, and ammo. And of course, more bulletproof vests. And then on October 29th, they'd roll a big black Studebaker up in front of the Central National Bank in Greencastle. Though they'd taken some extra precautions against being robbed, one of which was a steel cage over the door to hold a security guard, when that guard decided it was time to take a break, the gang, likely having spent the last couple days watching the place, made their move. Charlie Mackley and Dillinger strolled into the lobby, removing their Tommy guns from inside their long trench coats, and announced the holdup. Then the Jackrabbit vaulted over the railing into the teller's area and began bagging up the loot, which would come to total between $32,000 and $75,000, depending on whose estimate you're willing to believe, Dillinger's or the bank's. Harry Pierpont, who really should have been dubbed Hothead Harry rather than Handsome Harry, pistol whipped an old man coming into the bank and took his money too for good measure. They fled only moments before a worker at the nearby college treasury office arrived to make a sizable deposit, which might have put them close to 6 figures. And here's where it feels like the stars had really aligned for Dillinger. The Terror Gang had grown so big-headed in their recent successes that they decided a getaway driver was no longer necessary. So they left their car idling unattended on the street outside, all while the county sheriff was sitting in his office at the courthouse right across the street. While the guys were still inside the bank, a loan officer slipped out the back door and spotted the waiting vehicle. He tried looking for a way to puncture the tires and failed to spot the bag of roofing nails in the back seat. So instead, he went to find a phone to call the police. Had he found the roofing nails, or had he run across the street to get the sheriff rather than to a phone where they instructed him to remain where he was? Or had there been rotating security guards so the door wouldn't have been left unguarded for any time at all? The list goes on and on. There were so many opportunities where all of this could have gone wrong for Dillinger and the gang. But the universe, for whatever reason, just seemed to be on his side. Heck, they even managed to skirt around a train that had blocked their exit out of town. And to add insult to Captain Matt Leach's injury, his roving Dillinger mobile squad was way over on the other side of the state. So they were no good. One other thing. Now that the banks were insured, many of the ones hit not only by Dillinger, but by a lot of other gangs and lone hopefuls across several states were known to inflate the amount of their losses when filing their claims, leading a lot of journalists and others to wonder if some of these heists were engineered setups between the bank owners and the criminals, so that the insurance companies could cover not only any losses from the robberies, but any embezzlement being perpetrated by the bankers themselves. Corruption exists on all levels of society. A lot of these suspicions would be confirmed decades later when transcripts of wiretaps revealed such engineered robberies had indeed occurred, though they didn't name the actual institutions during the phone calls. But money was beginning to really flow from the state treasuries at this point, as hysteria on the law enforcement side kicked into overdrive. That gap between the cops and robbers I mentioned at the beginning of the episode began to close pretty rapidly, allowing the police to begin filling out their arsenals and vehicle fleets, as well as deputizing anyone willing to put themselves between a fleeing bank robber and freedom. The city of Marion began to arm their fire department to act as a supplemental police force. The jails in various towns were also beefing up their security and construction with steel reinforcements and machine gunners to prevent any further attempts at breakouts. Even the prison in Michigan City hired an elite guard unit and armed them with Tommy guns to patrol the prison perimeter 24 hours a day. And the feds were starting to get involved, with National Guard troops now being stationed at the police barracks. But Dillinger and the gang, perhaps sensing the growing heat or perhaps just growing bored with the flat landscape, decided it was time to decamp for the bright lights of Chicago, where they could better blend in. John and Billie rented an apartment in the Oak Park area, while Harry Pierpont and his girl Mary Kender, another Mary, who'd assisted in the prison break, by the way, they moved in next door. The rest of the gang, well, they scattered about the cities, out to just find their own way and check back in every once in a while. They didn't dress too flashy or try to bring too much attention to themselves, and they told their girlfriends not to drink too much so as to avoid spilling any secrets. Dillinger must have learned his lesson from his previous girlfriend named Mary. The thing is, while Harry Pierpont was a bit of a homebody, Dillinger couldn't sit still. He wanted to be out on the town every night, willing to take the risk of strolling at the World's Fair, which he was just obsessed with. He was always at the World's Fair when he was in Chicago. But they knew they'd eventually have to get back to work. That's the problem with money. It spins too damn fast. Though they'd briefly entertained the idea of combining forces with Babyface Nelson's crew, they worried about letting too many people into their circle of trust and decided to stick with their familiar territory of Indiana, Illinois, and Ohio. What they were completely unaware of, though, was just how much muscle was being assembled far off to the east in Washington, D.C. President Roosevelt had initially been quite slow to address problems of crime, and he had no desire to assemble a national police force. His first appointed Attorney General, Montana Senator Thomas Walsh, was so old and frail that he apparently died on the way to being sworn in. His replacement, Homer Cummings, a mayor from Connecticut, was a bit more of a vigorous ballbuster, and he ensured that the then head of the Bureau of Investigation, a guy you may have heard of named J. Edgar Hoover, would continue to stay on in that capacity. And Hoover, well, I'm not going to spend too much time on him here because I think he's someone who warrants his very own series on this show. Such was his influence on the American justice system, both then and now. And yes, I do count him as a villain of sorts. But back in those days, the Bureau of Investigation was a small startup body, just shy of 300 or so agents who didn't carry weapons and couldn't even make arrests. They were mainly there as a mobile wing of the Justice Department, sticking to investigations on native reservations and things like stolen cars across state lines. And you'll want to hold on to that particular thought for a little later because it will become quite relevant to the story. Hoover imagined his agents as nameless, faceless entities that could operate completely undercover and without any accountability to the press. But then something happened on June 17th, 1933, that would change everything for the fledgling bureau. Back in episode 1 in the Zeitgeist Zeppelin, I mentioned a guy named Charles Pretty Boy Floyd and how he had the record for killing the most federal agents. Well, he began adding to that tally when, along with his gang, he attempted to free one of their henchmen, Frank Nash, from custody while he was being transferred back to Leavenworth Prison after an escape. One of Hoover's men, along with 3 cops as well as Frank Nash himself, all died in that particular shootout. After that bloodbath, Hoover was able to milk a whole lot more cash and authority from Congress. By the summer of 1934, his agents were finally armed and imbued with the ability to make arrests. Congress also passed a law making it a federal crime to rob federally insured banks. Again, with that lag I mentioned earlier, it was closing faster by the day, and not all because of Dillinger. But as Johnny and Billie and Harry and the rest of the terror gang were living it up in Chicago that fall of 1933, they were oblivious not only to the growing threat of the feds, but to the moles in their own midst. Remember how I mentioned the Pinkertons, who were also tracking Dillinger? Well, one in particular, a man named Forrest Huntington, was working in conjunction with the Illinois and Indiana police to track Dillinger's movements, using a snitch inside Dillinger's circle named Art McGinnis. McGinnis wasn't healthy enough to be one of the main gang, but he did favors for Dillinger here and there, like helping him fence stolen bonds. Dillinger trusted him enough to share information with him about planned heists and the gang's whereabouts, which McGinnis would then relay back to Huntington. Captain Leach was absolutely adamant that Dillinger and his associates, especially Harry Pierpont, be killed on sight. Huntington, however, was adamant that they not make too big a splash for fear of icing out his mole, McGinnis. Eventually, the police agreed to perform a sting of sorts. They'd track Dillinger down, making a series of doctor's visits in Chicago, and they had eyes on him, Pierpont, and Frechette, though no moves were made on them. Interestingly, though, Dillinger, coming out of the doctor's office and heading back to their hideout, recognized the car that was following him and Billie around because he'd helped purchase it for a fellow gang member who was later arrested, Sam Goldstein. As I said, the cops like to reuse disposed fleet vehicles, and in Derry Matera's book, he said Dillinger likely asked for certain customizations on vehicles he purchased so he could more easily recognize them out in the world. Upon recognizing the vehicle, Dillinger attempted to speed away, but not before the police in Goldstein's vehicle opened fire. No one in Dillinger's vehicle was harmed, and he was able to make it back to the main hideout to round up the rest of the crew who were having themselves a little party. Luckily, they had backup apartments all over the city. Dillinger was able to quickly put 2 and 2 together on the goon squad and the information that led them to his location, and knew that Art McGinnis was the most likely leak. The Pinkerton, meanwhile, was absolutely furious that his carefully laid plans to track Dillinger and wait for the most opportune time to arrest him were all laid to waste by overzealous cops. He advised Art McGinnis to get out of town while the getting was good. With the gang spooked and driven even further underground, Huntington knew he had to start all over again. And it isn't long after this that things with the terror gang would begin to fall apart bit by bit. Already whittled down to 7 members, they would soon lose 2 more. Ed Schaus was cut loose after flirting too much with Billie Frechette, and Harry Copeland, Well, he would soon be expelled because of a bad drinking problem, which was making him dangerous to be around. Copeland would soon be arrested in front of a nightclub, drunkenly waving a pistol around and threatening a sex worker who'd apparently stolen money from him. Once he dried out in jail a bit, Copeland would soon begin copping to certain robberies while being very careful to deny any involvement in the murder of Sheriff Sarber in Lima, which was a certain sentence to the death penalty. The remaining 5 members of Dillinger's terror gang would watch all that news unfold in the papers up in Racine, Wisconsin, where they finally settled for a bit thanks to a friend of Billie Frechette's. They were set to perform a robbery on the American Bank and Trust Company, which was all but certainly a made-to-order job by the bank officers. Apparently, this particular institution was well known for its embezzlement schemes. After Harry Pierpont disguised himself as a Red Cross worker, hanging posters on the bank windows to help conceal what was about to go down inside, Dillinger and the gang got to work. Things, though, went wrong pretty much right off the bat when Charles Mackley accidentally discharged his weapon at one of the tellers that he was ordering around, shooting him in the hip and causing a huge ruckus that allowed the teller to trigger the silent alarm, alerting police. But there was a problem, as there's always a problem here. There had been nothing but false alarms from the bank for the last several weeks, sort of a boy who cried wolf scenario. And so the police, they didn't take the threat that seriously, but they responded quite casually, taking their sweet time, though they did remember to grab a Tommy gun before they went, thinking it would make for an interesting prop while they reset the glitching alarm once again. They even managed to miss the gang's very distinctive-looking Buick with bright yellow wire wheels idling nearby. And they'd actually hired a getaway driver this time, though I think that would come back to bite them in a bit. The officers walked into quite the scene with the robbery in progress. One of the gang, Russell Clark, cried out that the cops had a machine gun. Well, Charlie Mackley, he fired on the officer and took him down. A crowd was gathering around outside, trying to peer around the posters to see what was going on. So Mackley fired again, this time at the windows high overhead to scare them away, pelting them with shards of glass. Once Dillinger and Pierpont emptied the vault, they knew they were going to have to go out the front. They tried a back escape, but it was on the second story and it was way too high to jump. So they grabbed every bystander they could, including the one remaining police officer, and used them as human shields. And they started making their way out through the lobby and out through the front door. Well, more cops were arriving just as the group emerged outside. Charles Mackley let loose with the Tommy gun again on full automatic this time, showering the block with bullets and filling it quickly with masonry dust and more broken glass. Once the gangsters, protected by their bubble of hostages, reached the getaway car, they ordered them to stand on the car's running boards to keep anyone else from firing on the vehicle as they made their way out of the city. They were hanging on to their belts from inside to keep them from falling off. It's just such a crazy thing to even imagine. I'm almost seeing it in like a black and white silent movie kind of situation. Once outside the city limits, they brought the hostages into the car and rode along with them a little longer, contemplating hanging on to one of the female hostages if she knew how to cook. Luckily for her, though, she didn't. About 30 miles outside Racine, the crew ditched the hostages alive. They then split up the money and headed back to Chicago. Their getaway driver, a man named Leslie Homer, was soon arrested and began spilling his guts to the police. Dillinger and Pierpont, realizing they needed to get out of town and lay low a while, took their ladies and went their separate ways for a little holiday. Johnny and Billie headed to Arkansas, and Pierpont and Mary Kinder headed down to Texas. But the quiet wouldn't last long. And I think that's about as good a place as any to wrap up part 2 of the John Dillinger saga. Will I be able to wrap it up on part 3? Well, I can't say for sure. This case is such a treasure trove, and I want to make sure I include as many interesting tidbits as I can. Also, I recently took a trip up to the Allen County Historical Society in Lima, Ohio, about 90 minutes away from me. They have a nice little treasure trove of Dillinger artifacts on display in their museum, including the actual cell Dillinger was held in, and Sheriff Sarber's desk and gun, as well as some handwritten notes from both Dillinger, as well as one from Mary Longnecker from Dayton. It was neat to be able to see these things up close. I took pictures of everything and put them up on the Vintage Villains Soiree Facebook group, so you can go take a look at them there, and I'll also have them up on Instagram. If you have any questions about Dillinger or any of the supporting cast in this story, shoot me an email at vintagevillainspod@gmail.com or hit me up on the socials. And a big shout out to my supporters on Patreon who help keep the time machine running in exchange for early episodes and more. I'll be back next week with part 3 of this saga. In the meantime, my friends, you know what to do. Get out there and make good history, and I'll see you next time in another century.